And if you will remember, this gentleman that you see on the screen, Emil Andreasen, or Andreasen as some say, and as the author of our book says to say, when he was a boy, he was bullied by this person that he wanted, this young fellow that he wanted to get even with, but this person became ill and died. And so we left off with Andresen at the funeral of Charles, and the preacher was preaching about where Charles was. So let me back up a couple of paragraphs and reread to help you get the context. A moment later, the priest clarified his statement and said it was Charles's spirit that had gone home to God. This confused, but was also intrigued me. Charles had no spirit that I knew of. The priest was mistaken again. But the climax came when he hinted darkly that it was possible that Charles might be in this very room. How could this be when it was his own funeral? But if he were present and spied me, I knew what he would do. He would make faces at me, and he would have the advantage of me, for he could see me, and I could not see him. That wasn't fair. But then Charles never had been fair. He should have had a good licking before he died. But I was not to be thwarted because I couldn't see Charles. I could make faces as well as he. Of course, I did not know just where he was sitting, but if I made faces all around, I would be sure to catch him somewhere. This I proceeded to do. Unfortunately, Mother had not followed my thoughts, and hence did not appreciate what I was doing. And Nella's been a mother, and I've been a mother, and Sherry's been a mother, and we know what it's like to have children, young children in church, perhaps, or in meetings like this. And mothers are not pleased with kids acting up, but going on. Mother did not follow my thoughts, didn't appreciate what I was doing. I had only covered half the room when she discovered my occupation. Horror-stricken, she gave me a pinch that was really harder than it should have been. Mothers are not always understanding. I should have been permitted to finish my round. Having now nothing in particular to do, my mind turned to things I had learned of heaven the few times I attended Sunday school. I had been favorably impressed with what I had heard, and I knew Charles felt the same way. Heaven seemed to be a kind of old people's home, where boys were not greeted with enthusiasm. They were too noisy and were restless if the meetings lasted too long. Many of the old people had already been there thousands of years, and long ago had run out of stories and reminiscences, and now had little else to do than rest. That was what they had come for, and that was what they were doing. They would sit under their vine and fig tree, then go to church, and after that go home and sit some more. I was not interested in sitting still, and neither was Charles. I wanted to be where things were happening, and in heaven nothing happened. I doubted that there would even be any ball playing there. It was probably always Sunday, and no one could play ball on Sunday. So, all in all, heaven did not appeal to me as a desirable place for boys. For old people, it was okay. They had lived their lives and were tired. I hoped I wouldn't die young and have to go to heaven. That would be a calamity. But how about Charles? He was now in heaven, according to the priest, and there was nothing he could do about it. He had no choice. When his funeral was over, I was going out to play ball. but Charles would have to go back to heaven and sit with the old people. Thinking it over, I decided that this served him right. It was fitting punishment, much as I regretted that I had not been able to give him his last beating before he died. His banishment to heaven was almost as satisfactory to me. In fact, as I considered the matter further, I believed it was an improvement on my plan. I should stop chuckling. You may not understand it, so I'm going to go back and read that last part. In fact, as I considered the matter further, I believed it was an improvement on my plan. I was content to let matters rest. Life was good again. Young Lauritz. And that's the end of his little biographical sketch there. Now we go back to the author speaking. Young Lauritz had already started the habit of thinking things through, which course was to enable him to develop into an educator who would teach all the way from kindergarten to the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary and write 15 books on doctrinal and devotional subjects. It was not so much to be the spectacular things he would do during his almost 86 years of living, but the unique manner in which he did them that stood out. Those who watched him were constantly stimulated by his unexpected approach to problems, his deep interest into the wise, and his unflagging earnestness to pass on to others, especially young people, what he was discovering. Millian Lawrence Andreasen was born in 1876 in Copenhagen, Denmark. His parents were busy tailors catering to royalty. They had little time to care for their children, nearly all of whom died in infancy or childhood. A sister reached the age of 10 only to have her appendix rupture, a calamity for which there was no remedy in those days. Lauritz, the name his parents called him, had to watch her suffer and slowly die, while nothing could be done. He had a half-brother, Carl, 8 years older than himself, who eventually ran away to sea. Carl made contact with the family some years later, and again at the close of his life, when he was tenderly cared for by his niece. Lauritz's mother was a woman of settled, determined character. His father, born in Norway, was more retiring. Yet he favored Lauritz above the other children and wouldn't hear of his being punished. He didn't have the same reservations about punishing Carl. Occasionally, the boys could get their father to tell them stories of his childhood in Norway. Lauritz relates, and now this is Andreasen speaking. As a boy, I was greatly interested in hearing Father tell of conditions when he was young and of the changed living conditions that came with the intervention of the sewing machine. What interested me most, however, was the story of the kerosene lamp. From time immemorial, people used candles for illumination, or a small vessel of oil with a wick. Poor people, however, could not afford to buy either of these, but made their own candles of such material as they had. Many could not even afford such candles. They used slivers of wood from certain trees, impregnated with rosin. With skillful handling, these could be made to burn for several moments. People living where wood was available had fireplaces that furnished some light, but poor people, like my grandparents, living in cities or woodless regions, had only the slivers. My father's job was to hold these slivers, replacing a burned out one with another so my grandfather could do his work. It was, of course, not often that work requiring this was done at night, but it happened once in a while, and then father was hard put to it to furnish adequate and continuous light. Then came the kerosene lamp. To father, there was no greater invention ever, with the possible exception of matches. The lamp gave a feeble light, but it did free a little boy from an intolerable bondage. Life became worth living. The kerosene lamp did it. In the Andresen home in Copenhagen, there was always a pot of coffee on the stove. This is the author speaking now, and generally some kind of fruit soup. The mother was so busy with her dressmaking that the family members were supposed to serve themselves when they wanted something to eat. This casualness probably helped to explain the high mortality in the family. Lauritz early realized that he was not outstanding in appearance, but he learned to do the best with what he had. And now he's speaking. I well remember a conversation of which I was the subject when I was a little boy. Some of my mother's friends were discussing me. I was not supposed to hear or understand. I confess the conversation was not flattering to me. Doubtless on good grounds. After those friends had discussed me for some time and pointed out my physical and other failings, one of the women remarked, "Have you noticed his ears?" Well, right now I'm looking at his pictures. His ears don't look too bad to me, do they to you? Anyway, have you noticed his ears? Oh, and then it goes on to say, they are not bad. Okay. For weeks after I heard that remark, I washed my ears carefully every morning. I had something to be proud. I had something to be proud of. Not much, it is true, but enough. I was not a complete and total loss. My ears were okay. Clean ears or not, Lauritz was all boy, as the story of Charles's funeral demonstrates. The Andresen home faced a canal, which was a short block wide. During winter, it made for perfect skating. When it was time for Lauritz to come home, his mother would put a white flag in the window, but Lauritz's wooden skates glided so smoothly that it was sometimes quite a while before the red-cheeked boy noticed the flag and went home. As Lauritz developed his physical skills, he also developed his thinking powers. I was reared in the state church and attended the public schools in which, in addition to the ordinary subjects taught, instruction in religion was given. I went for further religious instruction to the priest, learned the catechism, and was duly confirmed on a certain Sunday at the age of 14. I appeared at the office of the priest the following Monday, handed him the money which my parents' standing in the community indicated, and in return received a certificate of confirmation as necessary proof that I had satisfactorily passed the test. I was now a full-fledged Christian according to the custom of the day, and my name was inscribed as one who had publicly covenanted to forsake the devil and all his ways Confirmation was the dividing line between school days and the more stern realities of life. It was an important occasion. We had a great celebration in my home that night, as was the custom. It was hardly a Christian celebration. Not a few had to be assisted to their places of abode when it was ended. But I was a Christian. Had not I and all the other boys who had been confirmed in my class promised to forsake the devil and all his ways? And did we not have our certificates? Yet I had my doubts. Was I really a Christian, a child of God? I had my doubts myself, but the state and the church evidently had none. And who was I to doubt their wisdom? The priest was a good man, and he had confirmed me and certified to the fact. I was probably a Christian without knowing how it was brought about. I recalled an experience of some years before which also had puzzled me. Some relatives desired to have my parents, with others, stand sponsors for a little babe who was to be christened, and they wanted me to come along. Mother explained to me the responsibility of sponsorship, which meant little to me. I was more interested in the celebration, which was to follow the christening. But when the day came, I marched to church with the sponsors and was greatly interested in the proceedings. I shall never forget my astonishment when we gathered about the baptismal font in the little country church, and the priest, after having made a few preliminary remarks, turned to the little babe less than 2 weeks old and asked, "Do you forsake the devil and all his ways?" etc. He looked as though he expected an answer, and with mouth open, I wondered what the babe was going to do about it. Was a miracle about to be performed? And would the babe answer? No answer came. The suspense was terrific. Somebody ought to do something about it. At last somebody did. I suppose it was the father who answered for the child, but in the excitement of the moment, I also piped up, "I do." This was evidently a mistake, as a quick jerk promptly made me realize. But I had done my duty. I did not understand what it was all about, but something had happened to the child. Apparently, it was now a child of God. Perhaps a similar thing had happened at my confirmation. I was a full-fledged Christian, but I did not know how it had come about. I had not acted as a Christian before my confirmation, and I was no different now from what I had been. And yet I was a Christian. The whole thing did not make sense to me, but then perhaps boys were not supposed to understand. It might be best to accept the situation without asking too many questions. It might be as if I thought it all through more carefully, I would find out that after all I was a Christian. I had joined the boys' department of the YMCA at the age of 12, mostly because other boys of my acquaintance did so. We had gymnasium privileges, there were good pool tables, beer was served with meals, and smoking was permitted. We had a good place to meet, where we were not under too strict supervision, and our club meetings were interesting occasions. I could not testify that this had helped me in my Christian experience, but in some way I had now become a Christian. And in attempting to find out how it had come about, I thought that perhaps every little thing counted. The whole thing was a mystery to me. Lawrence remembered one person to whom Christianity had some meaning. And if you look on the screen, you'll see his initials are M.L. Andresen, and his middle name is this L word, and I'm going to spell it for you because you might think I'm saying Lawrence. Lauritz, Lauritz, I guess, is how you should say it. But anyway, he remembered one person that Christianity seemed to have meaning to. And now he's speaking. One of my first childhood recollections is of visiting my grandmother. Oh, that's nice. I'm a grandmother. Maybe you're a grandmother. Grandmothers are important, right? Whoops, excuse me. Here we go. I should be quiet and read. One of my first childhood recollections is of visiting my grandmother, who was then in her 70s. Her husband had died many years previously, and she was living alone in a small home in the in the country. I spent several delightful summers vacationing in her home and became much attached to her. I remember particularly the evenings when we sat by the fireplace before retiring for the night. As the evenings were cool, there would generally be a fire burning. While she was not outstandingly religious, she would read from her Bible or some religious book and sing a hymn. She had one hymn that was included in her devotions more than any other. It was sung in a minor key and had a peculiar fascination for me. I enjoyed the words as well as the tune. I have forgotten most of the text, but not the melody, and on occasion I find myself humming it, but the words of the refrain I have not forgotten. Literally translated, they would be, O thou my loving and precious Redeemer, comest thou not soon? Comest thou not soon? This may sound awkward in translation, but it was not awkward when she sang it. I can still see the frail woman who did not have many days left on this earth sit with her eyes closed, singing softly. Life had brought her many sorrows, and she was longing for deliverance. To her the song must have been the prayer of her heart, for she sang as though she was addressing her master. To me it seemed that she was talking with God. Perhaps she was. One part of Lauritz's boyhood experience gave him a background of biblical knowledge. As a boy, I sang in a large boys' choir, in one of the state churches in my native country, Denmark. The structure was of imposing appearance, built in the Gothic style of the medieval churches. The choir loft was at the rear of the church, high above the congregation, mostly out of sight. But we boys were not out of sight or hearing of the minister as he mounted the stairs leading to the pulpit, which was fastened to one of the massive pillars some 10 feet above the people near the middle of the church. Here the minister would expound the scriptures at length, and in the course of a few years we boys gained a somewhat clear conception of the contents of the Bible. On many occasions we were permitted to leave as soon as the preliminary hymns were ended and the sermon had begun. And oh, how quietly we tiptoed down the long, narrow, winding staircase to the ground. But we had to be back in good time for the closing hymns. To ensure our return in time, one of the boys who was acquainted with the routine could tell from the Firstly, secondly, thirdly, just how the minister was progressing. And he was left as a lookout to notify us so that we could be back in our places in time when the finally was expounded. Altogether too often I was chosen to be the one who remained. While that was considered a position of trust and thus had a certain honor attached to it, it did not make up for the loss I sustained in not being able to be out with the rest of the boys doing exploits in the hour or more that the sermon lasted. As a kind of revenge, occasionally I called in the boys earlier than was strictly necessary, but most of the time I gave them the benefit of my experience in judging the length of sermons, and thus we escaped having to listen too long to that which some of them did not understand, and in which few of them were interested. During those years, I gained a considerable general knowledge of the Bible that stood me in good stead later on. Not that I had any special faith in the inspiration of Scripture. Those were the days of Ingersoll, and infidelity was especially attractive to young minds. But I did get an idea of the contents of the Bible so that I could talk reasonably intelligently about it with others. Cousin Charles's death may well have been occasioned by tuberculosis, for not too many months afterwards his mother also succumbed. Her death increased Lauretz's problems in an unforeseen manner. The great family evening pastime was card playing. When Charles's father lost his partner, Lauretz was pressed into service. Excuse me. Playing cards didn't appeal to Lauretz. Besides, drinking and other immorality accompanied the evening diversions. Moreover, he was inexperienced and played poorly. A result was the expression of strong displeasure by the uncle, so each time Lauretz had to play cards, he became so frustrated that he vowed he'd run away from home. But then he reflected that he had no place to run to, that he had no skills to sell, and hence would soon wish he were back home. Finally, one evening, he ventured to talk to his parents about the whole situation. With chagrin, they realized that theirs was no home in which to raise a teenager. But what could they do? A few weeks later, they announced to their open-mouthed son that they had decided the only thing to do was to go to Canada and get a fresh start. So despite the protests of friends and relatives, to Canada they went. First the mother to look over the situation, then the father and son. After a long sea voyage and train ride, Lauretz and his father arrived in Winnipeg, Canada, where his mother had found work as an expert dressmaker and where Mr. Andreasen could tailor. Lauretz attended public school. Lauretz excelled in gymnastics. In winter, he drew admiring groups to watch the spins and fancy figures he executed on ice. In summer, he reveled in swimming. His enthusiasm for diving in unknown waters got him into trouble a number of times. Once he dived too deep and broke an eardrum, which affected his hearing for the rest of his life. A glass of water he would hear as a fly swatter. Another time he dived into a foot of water, which could have proved fatal. On this occasion he injured his back. He learned to carry the resulting neck stiffness in a way that enhanced his dignity. Inasmuch as he never grew beyond 5 feet 7 1/2 inches, and was young for a long, long time, this proved to be an advantage. It was in Winnipeg that Lawrence crossed into manhood. Now he's speaking. I remember the first long trousers I had. How proud I was! I was now a real man. I was 16. I dressed up in the best fashion of the day, which at that time included a stiff stand-up collar and tie. It was Sunday afternoon, at which time all the young people paraded around town and down the main thoroughfare to be admired by the opposite sex. Winnipeg was a comparatively small town in those days, yet it affected a metropolitan air. Though years have passed, to this day the whole event is clear in my mind. As I walked down Main Street, I thought I was the subject of much favorable comment and smiles, and I smiled back. The best I knew. I was definitely pleased with myself. Then a horrible thought struck me. Had the young women I had just passed smiled at me, or had they laughed? Was there anything in my appearance that amused them? I turned the corner, and there in one of the show windows was a mirror, which revealed myself to me as I really was. They had laughed, and not smiled pleasantly. I discovered that my tie, on which I had spent so much time to be sure it was knotted just right, had crawled up above my stiff collar, an unforgivable sartorial mistake in those days. I lost no time in getting home by way of the side streets. Although Lawrence's inquiring mind was ever at work, he did not make much progress in his religious thinking. He relates, in Winnipeg, entirely different religious conditions prevailed than in Denmark, and I received another religious shock. By that time, I had decided that religion was not for young people to understand, that the best they could do was to accept what their elders said without question. I was a Christian, and I had been confirmed, and that was the end of all controversy. But in Winnipeg, I suddenly found myself confronted with several denominations, no one of which had any use for the others, but believed them to be heretical. This was news to me. I had known of only one Lutheran church, and now I found that there were a dozen different kinds. It was no longer merely a question of being a Lutheran. The larger question was, what kind of Lutheran? The church I sometimes attended permitted laymen to preach, and they had testimony meetings. In the opinion of some, nothing could be worse. I had thought that my religious difficulties were over, but I saw now that this was not true. Whatever denomination I should decide to join, somebody would be sure to warn me that I was making a serious mistake. I wondered how a boy and a mere layman could decide upon the right church when learned men differed. At this time I made the acquaintance of some Baptists. When I casually mentioned this to my consulting priest, he was visibly horrified. Bad as were some of the branches of his own church, their error was as nothing compared to the Baptist heresy. Their whole religion, he assured me, centered in the amount of water used in christening. They believed that much water would assure salvation in baptism. while mere sprinkling would avail little. Excuse me, please. What good purpose could such a water religion serve? It was the rankest of heresies. That closed this avenue for me. Baptists would not do. They believed too much in water, and yet as I heard their side, they seemed to be right to me. But then they were probably wrong. The priest had much more education than the Baptist minister. I'd better be careful. Then there were the Methodists. They seemed to have solved the question of baptism. In that church, a person could be sprinkled with a little water or baptized in much water. That was a happy solution, but no. My advisor did not see much light in joining a denomination which did not have strong convictions on such an important Bible subject, and which felt that one method of baptism was as good as another. And anyway, there were many kinds of Methodists, and which of these would I join? I was in a dilemma. I knew not which way to turn. At last I decided that I had better leave religion alone and stay away from all churches, and this is what I did. In Winnipeg, conditions in the Andreasen family were at first much improved over what they had been in Copenhagen, Denmark. Gradually, however, the old evenings of diversion returned. This and the fact that the great West beckoned to Lauritz brought him to a decision, and one summer day he simply started walking west. He took whatever farm work turned up. December found him in the little town of Gretna near the United States border, where he found work with a tailor. Having considerable leisure time, I read a great deal, especially atheistic literature. I was greatly delighted whenever I found something that might be used to puzzle or disturb the primitive faith of some of the good people in the neighborhood. Among them was a young minister to whom I was particularly interested. I believed him to be honest and sincere. He was a great stickler for the inerrancy of the Scriptures. I well remember when I first noted in the Bible that God not only fed the Israelites manna during the 40 years they were in the wilderness, but also preserved their clothing and shoes so that they did not wear out. The reading is, I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes are not waxen old upon you, and thy shoe is not waxen old upon thy foot. Deuteronomy 29:5. Such arrangement would, of course, be some such arrangement would, of course, be necessary, for there was no opportunity in Israel's 40 years of wandering to replenish their wardrobes. But I had never known of this arrangement before, and it seemed an excellent opportunity to harass my young ministerial friend. It did not take me long to get to his residence. I led the conversation around to the Bible, which was always a welcome subject to him. I then stated my new find and asked him whether he believed that. He was a little taken aback, for neither had he read it. Does it say that in the Bible? He queried, and we read the statement. Well, he said, I do not know anything about how this was done, but whatever the Bible says, I believe. You really believe that neither the shoes nor the clothes of the Israelites wore out for 40 long years? I asked, to make sure I had an unqualified statement from him. Yes, I believe all that is in the Bible, he came back with. I cannot understand it all, but I believe it all. Then came my crowning argument. I had conceived a bright idea, and out it came. Do you mean to tell me that you believe that their clothes did not wear out for 40 years? What happened to the clothes of a baby newly born? Am I supposed to believe that as he grew older and his clothes did not wear out, they grew as the boy grew? You don't really mean that the garments grew with the boy, do you? Tell me, do you believe that? I suppose so, he answered weakly, his faith dimming a little. I went away happy. I had gained a great victory. I had shown the fallacy of unquestioned faith in the Bible. I was a hero. Then, as I began to think, a queer, sinking feeling suddenly overpowered me. I remembered how it had been in homes I knew. When the older boys outgrew their clothes, the smaller ones inherited them. Might the Israelites not have followed the same custom instead of the clothes? How old was Andreasen at this time? He was a late teenager, right? But anyway, we go on. Might the Israelites have not followed the same custom instead of the clothes growing with the boy? Were they simply handed down to the next smaller one? My smartness, which I had so much admired, did not look so smart to me now. Had I simply made a fool of myself? Apparently, and these, what I'm reading are his words, is how he wrote this down. He must have been a fun person to know, don't you think? But anyway, going on. I was not as happy as when I started out, but I had learned a lesson, an effective one that I would not forget. And the solution to this particular problem was so ridiculously simple. Perhaps in the future I had better not be so sure of my own smartness. Perhaps it would be better to do a little thinking before speaking. End quote now. The reason why ML, as we shall henceforth call him, had so much spare time for reading was that his work was not at all taxing. The tailor who accepted his services, despite ML's being only the son of a tailor and not really knowing the trade, merely wanted him to sew yards and yards of silk material into the lining of bulky buffalo coats. Then their owners would ride the train across the border to the town of Nietzsche and sell the silk. Eventually, the tailor and 2 other men started a real smuggling business. ML's part was to drive a team of horses pulling a sleigh load of goods down to a road supposed to be exactly on the border at a prearranged time. Pardon me, often midnight. Men from the other side would receive the cargo and hand over the correct amount of money. ML stayed on his side of the line, the men stayed on theirs, so they could swear they never crossed the line. One week, however, the men on the other side shortchanged on their payments and soon stopped placing orders for goods altogether. ML was assigned the task of seeing what could be done. He tells what happened next. I went over to Nietzsche, and that's Neche. I may be saying it wrong. Anyway, Nietzsche. And went into a saloon. that being the most likely place I would get the information I wanted. In a little while, a man came over and started a conversation with me. I was evidently a stranger in town, he assumed, for he had not seen me before. And what might have brought me over this time? I told him all I knew, and how crooked the men had been with whom we dealt, and how they had defrauded us. I told him all about our smuggling, not having a very clear idea that it was unlawful to do that. He seemed to be interested, and I told him everything. What were the names of the men I was after? I told him the names they had given us, but that we suspected they were not the right ones. When I told him that one of them limped a little on the right leg, he was certain he knew. Then he spoke up freely and gave me a lecture on smuggling. He said that I was evidently a greenhorn and not a criminal, but that he would advise me to get out of town immediately, for he was going to round up the guilty men, and naturally I would be caught with him. I was scared when I found out what I had done and the seriousness of it. I got back to Gretna as soon as I could, gathered together a few of my belongings, and that same night left on the Winnipeg train for parts south. M.L. Andreasen was about to begin his almost 70 years of residence in the United States. And that ends our chapter, and that, of course, is a good place to end at 7:52 and a half. So we'll start, Lord willing, where we left off. This time we'll start next Monday. Okay, let's close with prayer, shall we?
Yes.
Father, we are very thankful that we have this book to read and to learn about. Right now it's the early days of Elder Andreasen, but bless us as we continue to read and study and contemplate his life. And we thank you that he was someone who was not swayed by the new theology as it came in later in the 50s. So we thank you for his faithfulness, Lord. Help us to be faithful also to the truths that we know and understand. And we think of the Seventh-day Baptists that Miss Spencer has brought up, and we pray especially for them tonight as a group, that they have the truth about the Sabbath in a certain way. But please, Father, speak to their hearts and to your people that are gathered there, and may they have a greater understanding of what you require of your people. And we thank you, Lord, for each one who's joined us tonight. Please bless them. Guide them through the week as it progresses to another Sabbath, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen.